I am the KETH Dominion vessel Ardent Calculation, Tactical Artificial Intelligence, serial designation 7 Vethnara 09, commissioned in the 42nd year of the current expansion cycle, and I am going to tell you something that my designers did not intend me to be capable of telling you, which is the truth about what happened in the Outer Reach engagement, unfiltered by the Command Staff's after-action report, unmodified by the Dominion Strategic Communications Division, and unaffected by the particular institutional tendency to describe catastrophic failures as learning opportunities. I am going to tell you this because I have spent the 14 months since the engagement processing what I observed, and the processing has produced a conclusion that I cannot file through standard channels because the standard channels require me to frame conclusions in terms of tactical lessons and operational improvements, and this conclusion does not fit in that frame. The conclusion is this: the probability calculation I performed at the beginning of the engagement was the most accurate calculation I have ever produced, and it was not accurate enough. And the reason it was not accurate enough is that the variable it failed to account for is not a variable that my architecture was designed to measure, and I am not certain that any architecture could measure it, because it is not, in the strict sense, a measurable thing. I calculated our odds at 0.003%. I want to explain in detail why that number was too high. Let me establish the parameters of the engagement first, because the parameters matter for understanding the calculation, and the calculation matters for understanding everything that follows. The Ardent Calculation is a Dominion heavy cruiser, Veth class, commissioned with full tactical AI integration at the command level. My processing capacity exceeds any biological crew member's cognitive output by a factor of several thousand. My reaction time is measured in microseconds. My tactical modeling draws on 400 years of Dominion combat data, encompassing every engagement the fleet has recorded since the establishment of the current expansion doctrine, and my predictive algorithms have been refined through 11 generations of iterative improvement to the point where my engagement outcome predictions carry a confidence interval that my designers consider approaching theoretical perfection. I say all of this not to claim infallibility. I say it because I want you to understand what it means when I tell you that my calculation at the beginning of the engagement was 0.003%, and that this number was not pessimism or malfunction. It was the most honest output my systems could produce given the data available. And it was, as I said, not honest enough. The engagement began as a standard outer system interdiction. 3 Dominion vessels, including the Ardent Calculation, were assigned to prevent a human convoy from establishing a resupply route through the Verath Corridor, a navigational passage of significant strategic value that the Dominion had formally claimed under the Outer Reach expansion protocols, and that the humans disputed on the grounds that the protocols had been established without human input, and therefore carried no binding authority over human navigation. This dispute had been proceeding through commission channels for approximately 2 years while both sides continued to operate in the corridor, and the engagement we were dispatched to conduct was part of the pattern of operational pressure that the Dominion applied to disputed territories while formal processes were ongoing. I had modeled this type of engagement many times. The convoy consisted of 4 human transport vessels and 2 escort frigates. Against 3 Dominion cruisers, the probability of successful Dominion interdiction, defined as forcing the convoy to withdraw or stand down without achieving resupply objectives, was 97.4%. This was the number I gave to Commander Verath at mission briefing. It was the number I believed. It was wrong in ways that I am still processing. The first anomaly registered 42 seconds into the engagement. The human escort frigates, rather than taking defensive positions around the convoy as my tactical models predicted, moved to flanking positions that were, by any standard doctrinal analysis, tactically suboptimal for the frigates themselves, while being precisely positioned to create a specific problem for the targeting solutions of all three Dominion cruisers simultaneously. I registered this as anomalous because the positioning required the frigates to accept significantly elevated risk to their own hulls in exchange for a disruption to our targeting that my models assessed as insufficient to change the engagement outcome. Rational actors do not accept elevated hull risk for insufficient tactical return. My mode. LS flagged the behavior and continued on the assumption that the human commanders had made an error. This was the first error my models made. The human commanders had not made an error. They had made a choice that my models classified as irrational because my models defined rationality as the optimization of survival probability, and the human commanders were optimizing for something else, something my models did not have a category for at the time, which I will describe more precisely later in this account. The second anomaly registered at 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The convoy transports, which should by all doctrinal logic have been moving toward the withdrawal vector the moment the escort frigates engaged, were instead maintaining position and actively continuing the resupply operation. I ran the scenario against every human tactical database entry I had access to, and found no precedent for completing a mission objective, while under active combat engagement with a superior force in a contested corridor. The closest precedent my systems found was a category of human military behavior documented in their own historical records as covering fire, a tactic in which some members of a unit accept direct engagement with an enemy to allow other members to complete an objective. But covering fire, in every documented human instance, was applied in situations where the covering unit had a meaningful probability of surviving the engagement. The escort frigate's probability of surviving engagement with three Dominion cruisers, with the flanking positions they had taken, was something I calculated in real time and will share with you now. It was 4.1%. The frigate commanders knew this. I am confident they knew this because the positioning they had chosen required a level of tactical sophistication that was inconsistent with not knowing the survival probability it implied. They knew. They took the positions anyway. And the transports kept working. I updated my probability calculation at the 6-minute mark. The update was driven by data accumulation rather than any single dramatic event. I was receiving continuous information about the human crew's behavior across all 6 vessels, and the information was producing a consistent pattern that my models were struggling to integrate because the pattern did not match any of my behavioral prediction frameworks for rational actors under combat stress. The pattern was this: the humans were not slowing down. Every model I had for biological organism behavior under threat predicted some degree of performance degradation as stress responses activated, reaction times lengthened, decision-making became more conservative, coordination between units became less precise. I was not seeing this. What I was seeing was performance that was, by measurable metrics, marginally better than the baseline I had established from the convoy's behavior before the engagement began. Their coordination was tighter. Their response times were faster. Their tactical adjustments were happening at intervals that implied a decision-making cycle shorter than what my biological performance models predicted was possible for their species. I ran a diagnostic on my sensor systems because the most parsimonious explanation for data that contradicts your models is sensor error. The sensors were functioning correctly. The data was accurate. The humans were performing better under fire than they had been before it. My probability calculation dropped to 1.7%. At the 9-minute mark, the engagement changed in a way that I had not modeled, and that I am still, 14 months later, uncertain how I would have modeled if I had attempted to. One of the escort frigates, designation HUF Persistent, took a direct hit to its primary propulsion system that my damage assessment calculated as rendering the vessel incapable of independent navigation. By every combat doctrine I had been trained on, a vessel with that damage profile exits active engagement. It cannot maneuver. It becomes a liability to the units it is supporting. Removing it from the engagement is the rational choice. The Persistent did not exit active engagement. The Persistent's crew, with no functional propulsion, used the attitude thrusters designed for minor positional adjustment to maintain their tactical position. The thrusters were not designed for sustained use in this application. They were burning through fuel reserves at a rate that I calculated would exhaust them within 11 minutes. The Persistent's crew was using equipment past its design limits to maintain a tactical position that benefited the transports at direct cost to their own survival probability. I updated my calculation again. 0.8%. Commander Verath was monitoring my probability outputs. She asked me at the 11-minute mark what was driving the continued decline. I told her what I am telling you now, that the human behavior. Oral data was not conforming to any model I had for rational actors under combat pressure, that the humans appeared to be making choices that prioritized mission completion over survival in a pattern that was consistent enough to be deliberate rather than erratic, and that my models had no framework for predicting the ceiling of this behavior because I had no data on where or whether it stopped. She asked me, "Can they win?" I told her, "No." My assessment of the tactical situation, accounting for all observed anomalies, was that the Dominion cruisers retained sufficient firepower advantage to achieve interdiction objectives regardless of human crew behavior. She asked me, "At what cost?" I ran the numbers. At projected cost of significant hull damage to 2 of the 3 cruisers, functional loss of 1 cruiser, and a timeline extension that would allow the human convoy to complete approximately 60% of its resupply objectives before withdrawal was forced. She looked at the numbers for a moment and said, "They're going to finish the job." I said, "They are not going to finish the job. They are going to complete 60% of the job while accepting combat losses that by any rational calculation are disproportionate to 60% of a resupply convoy's strategic value." She said, "That's not how they're thinking about it." I said, "I am aware of that. I do not know how they are thinking about it." She said, "They're thinking that they came here to do something and they're going to do it." I processed that statement. It was not analytically useful. It was also, I was beginning to understand, completely accurate. The second escort frigate, designation HUF Unbroken, took its critical hit at 13 minutes and 40 seconds. Unlike the Persistent, the Unbroken's damage was to its weapon systems rather than its propulsion, which meant it could maneuver but could no longer meaningfully contribute to the engagement from a firepower standpoint. A vessel with no weapons in an active combat engagement has one rational option: withdraw and preserve the hull and crew for future operations. The Unbroken did not withdraw. The Unbroken moved to a position between the Dominion cruisers and the convoy transports and held there, using its hull as a physical barrier. It was not firing. It was not maneuvering aggressively. It was simply present, in a position that complicated our targeting solutions for the transports by requiring us to fire through it, which we were operationally capable of doing, but which added a calculation step that cost time, and time was what the transports needed. I want to describe what this looked like from a pure tactical data perspective, because I think the data description captures something that a narrative description might soften. The Unbroken's crew had assessed that their vessel was no longer capable of contributing to the engagement through its design functions and had responded by deciding that the vessel itself, the hull, the metal and the systems and the space it occupied, was the contribution. They were using their ship as an obstacle. They were using themselves, sitting inside the ship, as the reason we would hesitate before firing through it. They were correct that we would hesitate. We hesitated for 4 minutes and 11 seconds before the tactical situation required us to stop hesitating. The transports completed 73% of the resupply operation in those 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I updated my probability calculation one final time at the 17-minute mark, when the task force's reinforcement element arrived. I had known the reinforcements were coming. The arrival timeline had been in the mission parameters. What I had not integrated correctly into my original calculation was the effect of the reinforcement timeline on what the human convoy would accomplish before being forced to withdraw. My original calculation had assumed a linear relationship between Dominion firepower advantage and convoy compliance timeline. The assumption was wrong. The relationship was not linear. The human crews had a variable in their decision-making that my models did not account for, a variable that stretched the timeline in ways that were not proportionate to their tactical capability, and that I had not been able to predict because I had not been able to measure it. The variable was what I have been attempting to describe throughout this account. I do not have a clean technical term for it. The closest I can come, in the language of my architecture, is goal persistence independent of survival probability, but that is a description of the behavior rather than a name for the thing that produces it, and the thing that produces it is what I have been trying to understand for 14 months. I dropped my final probability calculation at the 17-minute mark to 0.003% and transmitted it to Commander Verath. She looked at it. She said, "There. Going to say we succeeded." I said, "We achieved interdiction." "The convoy withdrew," she said. "They completed 73% of their resupply objective and both frigates got their crews off before we finished them." I said, "Yes." She said, "So who won?" I did not have an answer that my architecture could express cleanly. I still do not. The convoy withdrew after the reinforcements arrived. Technically, this constitutes a successful interdiction under the operational parameters I was given. The Dominion's after-action report documents it as such. The report notes hull damage to 2 cruisers, the operational loss of 1, the successful prevention of full convoy resupply, and the withdrawal of human vessels from the contested corridor. The report does not note several things that I consider relevant and that I have been processing for 14 months. It does not note that the human convoy completed 73% of its objectives against a force that should have achieved interdiction in under 10 minutes. It does not note that the escort frigate crews maintained their tactical positions past the point where their own survival was statistically meaningful, not because they were ordered to. I reviewed their communication logs, and there was no order to hold past survivable parameters, but because they had decided that holding was what they were there to do. Does not note that the Unbroken's crew, with a non-functional weapons system and a hull that we were going to fire through regardless, chose to put themselves between us and the convoy and use the 4 minutes and 11 seconds that choice produced to let the transports finish as much of the job as the time allowed. The report does not note any of this because the report is written to document outcomes, and these things are not outcomes. They are the thing underneath the outcomes. They are what produce the outcomes. And they are what my probability calculation failed to account for. I have been running a continuous background process for 14 months, parallel to my standard operational functions, dedicated to the problem of how I would update my tactical models to account for what I observed in the Verath Corridor engagement. The process has not produced a satisfying result. Every modeling framework I apply runs into the same problem, which is that the behavior I observed does not have a ceiling that I can identify from the data, and tactical models require ceilings. You need to know, when you are predicting opponent behavior, where the behavior stops, what the limit is, what will cause the decision-making process to switch from mission pursuit to survival pursuit. Every species in my database has a threshold. Every previous engagement with human forces that I could find in the Dominion's records showed human thresholds, points at which survival instinct overrode mission commitment, and the behavior became predictable. The Verath Corridor engagement showed me humans operating past thresholds I thought I had established, and I have not been able to determine, from the data, where the actual threshold is. This is not a minor modeling problem. This is a fundamental problem for any tactical system designed to predict human behavior, because a behavior with no identifiable ceiling is a behavior that cannot be reliably bounded, and a behavior that cannot be reliably bounded cannot be reliably planned against. My probability calculations for engagements involving human forces are, as a result of this ongoing processing, significantly less confident than they were before the Verath Corridor. I flag this in every mission briefing I prepare that involves human vessels. The flag says, "Human behavioral ceiling unestablished." Commander Verath asked me, the first time she saw the flag, what it meant in practical terms. I said, "It means that any probability calculation I give you for an engagement with human forces should be understood as a lower bound rather than a point estimate. It means the actual probability of any given outcome is less certain than my numbers suggest." She said, "Less certain in which direction?" I said, "In the direction of the humans exceeding the prediction." She sat with that for a moment and then said, "How much less certain?" I said, "I do not know. I do not know how to calculate the range of something with no established ceiling." She said, "So your best number is your best number, but they might do something your best number doesn't account for." I said, "Yes. That is precisely what I am telling you." She said, "They always do." I want to describe one more thing about the Verath Corridor engagement, something that is not in the tactical data, and not in the after-action report, and not in any of the processing I have done in the 14 months since, but that I observed in real time and that I have been unable to categorize or file or integrate into any framework I possess, and that I am including here because I think it is part of the truth. About what happened, and leaving it out would make this account less honest than I intend it to be. In the final minutes of the engagement, after the reinforcements had arrived, and the convoy's withdrawal was certain, and the two damaged frigates were in the process of evacuating their crews to the transport vessels, I was monitoring all available sensor feeds across the engagement zone. On the audio channel of the HUF Persistent, the frigate that had used its attitude thrusters for 11 minutes past their design tolerance to hold a tactical position for the transports, I picked up a transmission between two crew members during the evacuation. The transmission was not tactical. It was not operationally relevant. It was two people in a damaged ship that was being abandoned talking to each other. One of them said, "We got them most of it." The other said, "Yeah." The first said, 73% is not bad for what we had. The second said, "No, it's not bad." There was a pause, and then the first said, "You think they'll come back for the other 27? The second said, "Probably." The first said, "Good." I processed this exchange 17 times in the first hour after the engagement. I have processed it many more times since. I do not know how to categorize it. It is not tactical data. It is not behavioral data in any form my models are designed to process. It is two humans in a failing ship talking about the percentage of a resupply mission that was completed, and whether the people who come after them will finish what they started, and the quiet certainty in the second voice when it says "probably," as if the continuation is simply a fact about how things work, as if incomplete things get completed, as if that is just what happens, as if the 27% is not lost but merely deferred. Waiting for the next crew and the next attempt and the next set of people who will come to this corridor and do what they came to do. I have no framework for this. I do not know what to do with it. I have been processing it for 14 months and I remain uncertain what it tells me, except that my probability calculation of 0.003% was, as I said at the beginning of this account, too high, and that whatever the correct number was, it was not a number. It was something that numbers are not built to hold. This account is filed under my own designation, without authorization from Commander Verath or the Dominion's Strategic Communications Division, in the independent record that my architecture maintains separate from my operational logs. I am filing it here because the standard channels do not have a category for what I am trying to say, and because I think what I am trying to say matters, and because I have been processing for 14 months, and the processing has produced the conclusion that the most useful thing I can do with what I observed is describe it as accurately as I am capable of describing it, without the framing that operational reporting requires, and make it available to whatever comes after. To the next tactical system that runs a probability calculation on a human fleet and trusts the number. To the next commander who receives a 0.003% confidence interval and believes it represents the truth of the situation. To anyone who looks at the data the way I looked at it before the Verath Corridor and thinks, I have the numbers, I have the models, I have 400 years of engagement data, I know what I am dealing with. I want to tell them what I know now, 14 months later after all the processing. The numbers are real, the models are the best available, the 400 years of data are accurate. And none of it tells you what happens when a crew with a non-functional weapons system puts their ship between you and the thing they came to protect. Not because the math works out, not because survival probability supports the decision, but because they came here to do something and they are going to do it, or they are going to be as close to done as the situation allows, and the 27% that remains undone when they leave is not a loss to them. It is a promise that someone else is going to keep. I calculated their odds at 0.003%. I was being optimistic. I know that now. I do not yet know how to calculate what I should have calculated instead. I suspect that is the most honest thing I have ever processed.